right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're heading into occult archives. You know the deal here. We take these, well, kind of infamous books and we unpack them. Not like a book report, though, more like, getting into the heads of the folks who wrote this stuff.
Right, right. The stuff that freaked people out, intrigued them, made them scratch their heads back in the day. And we want to figure out why. What was so powerful about these books? What were they really saying?
Exactly. And let me tell you, today's pick is a doozy. It's called Demoniality, or Incubi and Succubi, by, get this, Ludovico Maria Sinistrari, 17th century. Demons, yeah. But not your typical fire and brimstone stuff. This guy's talking about something different, something a little more, shall we say, personal with those demons.
Yeah, you could say that. And the story of how this book even came to light is a wild ride in itself. So picture this. It's 1872, London, and a French publisher named Isidore Lizoux. He loved those kind of obscure, forbidden texts, right?
Yeah.
He stumbles into this little bookshop near Regent's Park owned by a Mr. Allen.
Okay, gotta stop you right there. This Mr. Allen, he was a character, right? He had this whole strategy for getting rare books on the cheap. He'd basically let all the big-time collectors go crazy bidding at auctions, and then he'd swoop in and buy up whatever they missed, often for pennies on the dollar.
Literally.
Yeah.
He had a thing for sixpence, apparently.
Yeah.
Thought it was his lucky number. So anyway, after one of these big auctions, Mr. Allen ends up with this stack of Italian manuscripts, probably a couple hundred years old. And guess what was tucked in there?
Demoniality, amongst titles like, On Poisons and, On Adders.
Adders, huh?
Right. Imagine that browsing experience. But yeah, Lizoux sees this demoniality, all Latin and mysterious, and he's immediately hooked. Demons, incubi, succubi, who wouldn't be? He even admitted later that he felt kind of obligated to buy something, just to be polite. But this book, with its promise of something totally out there, well, that sealed the deal. Sixpence well spent, even if Mr. Allen probably thought he was just getting rid of some old junk.
Oh, but this junk was a gold mine. The manuscript, it's beautifully preserved, 17th century Italian paper, bound in parchment, 86 pages long. The title and first page, those are in the handwriting of an older guy, probably Sinistrari himself. The rest is in another hand, like someone was writing under his direction, with all these handwritten notes and corrections all over it. Definitely looks like the original unpublished manuscript.
And to think, this thing had just come from a Sotheby's auction a few days before. It was part of the library of this English collector, Baron Seymour Kirkup, who died in Florence. The auction catalog even listed it, attributed to a Ludovico Maria Sinistrari.
See, right there, that's where the mystery starts. Lizoux, he's no slouch, he knows his stuff, but he couldn't find any record of this Ludovicus Maria Sinistrari guy. There was this one bookseller's guide that mentioned a Cutta Daimano, but it got him mixed up with someone else entirely. All Lizoux knew was that, according to the manuscript itself, the author was a theology professor in Pavia in the late 1600s.
Now, you gotta give Lizoux credit. He didn't give up. This guy was persistent, kept digging and digging, and eventually, boom, he figures out the author's real name, Ludovico Maria Sinistrari. And get this, he finds Sinistrari's big published work, a whole treatise on crime and punishment called De Delictis et Penis. And guess what? The church had put that book on its banned list, the Index of Forbidden Books. Later, they allowed it, but only with revisions.
So now Lizoux's thinking, maybe this Demoniality manuscript was like a little section of that bigger controversial book, and the church wasn't too happy about it either. But the weird thing is, the parts of Demoniality that had been published, they didn't have any of those church-ordered revisions. So after all that sleuthing, Lizoux realizes he's got his hands on something totally unique, never before seen. A real collector's dream.
Talk about a lucky sixpence, huh? All right, so we know the backstory is incredible, but let's get into the good stuff. What did Sinistrari actually say in this book? And one of the first things he does is try to separate demoniacal intercourse demoniality from bestiality. Now, that might seem obvious to us today, but back then, in those theological circles, it was a whole debate.
Oh yeah, it was a big deal. They were trying to figure out where these acts fit into the whole framework of sin, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of thinkers back then, they were following St. Thomas Aquinas, the big guy. And he basically lumped anything you did with a creature of a different species under the umbrella of bestiality.
Well, yeah.
Technically, that could include demons.
Right. Makes sense, in a way. But Sinistrari, he's like, hold on a sec. He's arguing that when St. Thomas said a thing of different species, he was probably only thinking about living animals. So Sinistrari's example is like, okay, what about having sex with a dead body, human or animal? That's not bestiality, he says. It's more like, desecration,
Yeah.
polluting something sacred. So for him, the main thing is, who are you doing it with? What's the nature of that partner?
Yeah, and that's where he gets into the whole demoniality thing. Sex with a demon. He's saying even if you believe that a demon can, like, possess a dead body to do the deed, it's still different. Because that body, it's just a shell, right? It's not a living being with its own feelings and will.
So he's drawing this line, and he even brings up the Council of Trent. They had these guidelines for confession, right? He says, look, they talk about confessing the details that change the type of sin you committed. So he's saying, if demoniality and bestiality were the same sin, then just confessing to bestiality after sleeping with a demon, that would be enough, right? But he doesn't think so. And on top of that, he says all the big theological guys, they consider demoniality a much more serious sin than bestiality. Like it was a whole different level of offense.
So he's laying down this foundation. Demoniality is its own thing. And now he wants to explore how it supposedly goes down. And he's not holding back. He's saying these demons, they come in male form, incubi, and female form, succubi, and they get it on with, well, everyone. Men, women, even animals, apparently.
And I gotta imagine a lot of people back then, and maybe even today, would be like, okay, come on, this is just fantasy, right? Like those stories about witches flaying around at night. But Sinistrari, he's adamant. He pulls in all these theologians, legal experts, even quotes this book called the Compendium Maleficorum to back him up. He's saying, sure, some cases might be all in your head, but in a lot of instances, these witches and wizards, they're actually physically there at these nighttime gatherings, and they're having real physical interactions with demons.
And he's got a whole system for how it works. He says there are two main ways demons do the deed. One is with people who've made these formal pacts, like a witch or a wizard's initiation, they call it a profession. And the other way is with regular folks who have nothing to do with witchcraft at all.
Now, this profession, it's like a ritual, a really dark one, based on what Sinistrari says he learned from witch trials. He lays out 11 steps. You've got making a pact with the demon, renouncing your faith, trashing religious objects, going through a fake baptism, taking a new name, giving them your clothes, bowing down to them, getting instructions, swearing off the Eucharist, insulting the saints, and finally, the demon brands you with a mark. It's intense.
Yeah, serious stuff. And after all that, Sinistrari says each witch or wizard gets their own personal demon, like an assistant, just for sexual pleasure. They called it the Magistellus, which means, like, assistant master. And this demon, it always takes the opposite sex of the human, or sometimes it shows up as a satyr or like a goat man for women, just adding to the whole unsettling vibe, right?
Right. Okay, so now the big question. How can a spirit, something with no body, have sex? Sinistrari explains that the common belief was demons either possessed dead bodies, male or female, whatever they needed, or they made temporary bodies for themselves out of all sorts of stuff, and this body, it could move and interact with humans like a real physical being.
And he doesn't shy away from the mechanics of it all either. He talks about demons impregnating women. As succubi, they'd take sperm from men, or as incubi, they'd collect it, often while men were asleep. Then Sinistrari says they'd preserve it, keep it alive using their own heat and spirit, and then put it in a woman's womb to get her pregnant. I mean, this guy goes there.
Wow. Okay, but here's the thing. It wasn't always about these formal pacts and witchcraft. Sinistrari also talks about incubi and succubi acting like, well, lovers with regular people who weren't involved in any of that dark stuff. He mentions this ancient story about Menipus Lycius and a succubus named Compusa. She disappears when he figures out who she really is. And then there's this story of a young, chaste Scotsman who gets visited by a beautiful succubus, but she can't seduce him.
And it wasn't just humans they were messing with. Sinistrari even has stories about incubi and mares, female horses. He says if the mare was cool with it, the incubus would pet her and braid her mane all fancy. But if she resisted, watch out. He'd mistreat her, even make her sick or kill her. Sinistrari claims this was like a common thing, daily experience, he says.
Yikes. Okay, then there's this whole section on these creatures, confolletti in Italian, duendes in Spanish, follets in French, basically a specific type of incubus. And these guys, they're different from the demons that possess people, Sinistrari says. They don't listen to exorcists, they're not scared of exorcisms, and they don't care about holy objects at all.
And here's where it gets even weirder. Sinistrari tells a story from his own life, back when he was teaching in Pavia. He knew this married woman named Hieronyma. She was constantly harassed by one of these follettis, an incubus. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. This went on for months. Well, this incubus, it would whisper to her, kiss her, make promises, even turn into a handsome young man. And the crazy part is, he'd appear in front of other people. but only she could see him. And he was mischievous, like stealing religious objects and jewelry, even hurting her physically. Sinistrari says he'd play pranks too, moving furniture around, and get this, he once built a whole wall out of roof tiles around her bed while she was sleeping with her husband.
No way. That's messed up.
Yeah, it's wild. And here's the thing. Sinistrari says this particular incubus never asked her to worship him or anything like that. All he cared about was her staying chaste. That detail's important. It'll come up later.
Okay, so now Sinistrari gets into this huge debate, and it's a debate that went on for centuries. Could a human being be born from sex between a human and a demon? Some folks even thought the Antichrist would be a product of such a union. High stakes, right?
Yeah, and the traditional view, backed by some theologians, was that children born from incubi would be, like, super tall, strong, arrogant, and just plain evil. They thought demon sperm was, like, top-notch. Abundant, thick, warm, full of vital spirits, whatever those are. And they'd use examples like, Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, or Alexander the Great, and say, maybe they were demon babies.
Right, because those guys were so successful and powerful, but Sinistrari, he uses what they knew about sperm back then to debunk this. He says the vital spirits in sperm, they evaporate quickly outside the body, so a demon couldn't possibly keep it alive long enough to cause pregnancy. Plus, he says making a baby is a natural act, it needs the man's body parts, and a child born this way would basically be fatherless. He just doesn't buy it.
He also tackles the whole giant thing, because there's that Bible passage about the sons of God sleeping with the daughters of men, and some people interpreted that as angels or incubi getting busy with human women. But Sinistrari, he sticks to his sperm argument. He says demon sperm wouldn't make bigger babies no matter how high quality it supposedly is. He offers other interpretations of those sons of God, but he's still leaning towards some kind of physical being, not purely spiritual.
Okay, and this is where Sinistrari throws us a curveball, a big one. He comes up with his own theory, and it's radical. He says, Incubi and Succubi, they're not just demons in disguise. They're not figments of the imagination. He thinks they're a whole other type of creature, a separate species, and he calls them corporeal, rational animals. They have bodies and souls, they're intelligent, and they live among us. They're born and they die just like humans. I mean, this totally changes how you think about creation, right?
It's mind-blowing, really. And he builds this theory partly on what the Council of Lateran said. They affirmed that God created both spiritual and physical things. So Sinistrari is saying, if God created the purely spiritual, angels, the purely material, the world, and beings with both a physical body and a spirit, humans, then why not creatures with rational minds and bodies that are less dense than ours?
It's like he's saying, hey, we're not the only intelligent beings in town. But then, of course, all these questions pop up. If these creatures are real, what are they like?
Right, and Sinistrari tries to answer those. He says they're rational animals, but different from humans because their bodies are more subtle, maybe made of finer elements like earth, water, air, fire. He thinks they were probably created by God at the beginning of the world, maybe even through angels. And when it comes to, the birds and the bees, Sinistrari thinks they probably reproduce, have male and female, senses, passions, needs, all that jazz. He even imagines they might have some kind of social structure.
So they're like a whole hidden society living alongside us. And what about their appearance?
Sinistrari figures they probably look similar to humans, since that's the most perfect form, according to the thinking back then. But since they're made of this subtler stuff, he thinks they might get sick and die less often than us. And get this, he thinks they might even be able to pass through solid objects because their bodies are so fine and can slip through the tiny pores in matter.
It's like they're ghosts, but with minds and feelings.
Okay, what about original sin and all that?
Sinistrari admits he's not sure about whether they sinned in the beginning, but he thinks Christ's redemption would apply to all rational creatures, so these corporeal rational animals would be included. And he believes they would live under some kind of divine law, even if it's different from ours.
So it's a whole other world, right? But if these creatures are real, why hasn't anyone else talked about them? Where's the proof? Sinistrari addresses this head on. He says, just because something's not mentioned in books doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You can't prove a negative, right? Exactly. And he goes on to point out some historical clues. He talks about Plato, the Greek philosopher who had this idea of demons, and he described them as these aerial beings with passive souls but rational minds. And Sinistrari points out that Plato didn't use that word demon in a bad way, and he promises to go deeper into what the Bible and the Church Fathers had to say about this later on.
But Sinistrari's main argument, it comes down to the way incubi and succubi act. Their desires, their emotions, even the fact that they can apparently get people pregnant. He says all that points to them having real bodies and senses. And the fact that they can be cunning and knowledgeable, that shows they have rational souls.
But some people back then would say, hold on, what if it's just the devil making it look like these creatures are real? A big illusion, right?
Yeah.
But Sinistrari, he has a counter-argument. He says, well, what about the times incubi have sex with animals? Animals don't have souls that go to hell, so why would the devil bother tricking people about that? And then he brings up the whole holy objects thing. He says incubi react differently to holy objects than regular demons do. They don't freak out, and sometimes they even attack exorcists. It's like they're not scared of that stuff.
Interesting. Okay, so then Sinistrari gets into these natural remedies against incubi. And he starts by saying there's this philosophical idea that material things can only act on other material things. So if you can use physical stuff to drive away an incubus, that means the incubus itself must have a physical body.
And then he brings in all these ancient writers like Dioscorides, Pliny, who talked about using herbs, stones, even parts of animals to get rid of demons. He even uses that story from the Bible of the angel Raphael telling Tobit to use fish liver to get rid of the demon Asmodeus. But Sinistrari focuses on the fact that the Bible says it was the smoke from the liver that did the trick. And he's like, see, it was the natural power of the smoke, not just God stepping in, that made the demon run away.
So he's building his case piece by piece, and then he adds in two stories from his own experience. One's about a nun who was being tempted by this water demon, an incubus, and they used fumigation and pills made of perfume to drive him off. The other one's about a deacon named Austin who was tormented by a fire demon, and they used cold herbs to get rid of him. And Sinistrali's point is, all these examples show that incubi can be affected by physical things, so they must have bodies themselves.
He even goes back to the Bible to find support for his theory. He looks at Psalm 77, where it says manna was angels' food. Now, most people interpret that metaphorically, like manna is a symbol for the Eucharist, but Sinistrari takes it literally. It's like, no, this was actual food for those corporeal, rational animals, those angels that live in the air.
So he's finding these little clues everywhere, bending the traditional interpretations to fit his theory.
And then he looks at the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. Most people think he's talking about the Gentiles, non-Jewish people coming into the Christian faith. But Sinistrari, he thinks those other sheep are his corporeal, rational animals. They're separate from humans, but they still need to hear Christ's message and be part of his flock.
Wow, he's really weaving this all together. Okay, so last thing. Sinistrari talks about whether demoniality is a sin, and he makes this distinction between having sex with a spiritual demon, like what witches and wizards do, and having sex with an incubus, which regular people might do.
He says that doing it with a spiritual demon is a much bigger sin because it involves abandoning your faith and worshiping the devil. But sleeping with an incubus, he says that's not as bad if the person doesn't realize it's a demon. He compares it to bestiality or sodomy. He even suggests that maybe sleeping with an incubus is somehow better for a human because these incubi, they're rational, they're immortal, and their bodies are more subtle, whatever that means. But he does say if you know it's a demon and you do it anyway, then yeah, that's a huge sin because of your intentions.
So it's all about what's in your head, what you believe is happening. Okay, and at the end of this manuscript, there's an appendix called Proof and Penalties, and it gets into the practical side of all this. How do you prove someone's guilty of demoniality, and how do you punish them? And he splits it up between witches and regular folks who've slept with incubi.
For witches, Sinistrari says the main thing is proving they made a pact with the devil. If you can prove that, then it's pretty much assumed they're doing the deed with demons. Eyewitness accounts of, suspicious behavior, that can raise red flags and maybe even justify torture to get a confession. But the sorcerer's own confession, that's the gold standard. And of course, if they find any physical signs, like the devil's mark, or any tools of the devil in their house, that's more evidence.
But proving someone had sex with an incubus, that's way harder because, demons are invisible most of the time. But Sinistrari does mention some cases where people were caught in the act. Like there's this story of a nun who was found in her cell with a young guy who turned out to be an incubus, and a neighbor saw them together, and of course they threatened her with torture to get her to confess.
But Sinistrari is careful to say that you got to be really careful with eyewitness accounts in these cases, because the devil can create illusions to make innocent people look bad. He says the judges, they have to rely on their own judgment and observations.
So it's all very tricky and a little bit terrifying, to be honest.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's Sinistrari's Demoniality in a nutshell. A 17th century deep dive into the world of demons, sex, and this crazy idea that there's another intelligent species living right under our noses.
Yeah, and, it's a wild mix of theology, philosophy, biblical interpretation, and let's be honest, some pretty bizarre stories. But it shows how Sinistrari was trying to make sense of some really strange stuff using the knowledge and beliefs of his time.
It definitely makes you think, right? Like, what's real? What's imagined? What's going on in the unseen world? And even if you don't buy into any of it, it's fascinating to see how people tried to explain the unexplainable back then.
It gives you a whole new perspective on those old folklore stories and myths, all those tales of people encountering strange creatures. Makes you wonder, could some of those be about Sinistrari's corporeal rational animals? Definitely something to ponder, even after we sign off.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us for another trip into the occult archives. See you next time.